mindset control over attitude. The computerized communication office that are the mental health office, the Department of Wellness under the Health and Safety Act. With this week's Educational Communication Office, we want to acknowledge the Hospitalised Act under its responsibility to acknowledge the Mental Wellness Act. When we calculate under the Mental Wellness Act, then we calculate in acknowledgement to the Hospitalised Act. The Act to therefore have the right, the Act to therefore implement the right, the Act to therefore respond right. The Hospitalised Act, that are the Computerized Communication Office, that the Mental Wellness Departmental Office are acknowledged under. The Hospitalised Act that becomes a legislative law where the Department of Wellness are then therefore acknowledged at. And when the Department of Health, there are the Department of Wellness, there are the Mental Wellness Departmental Office, acknowledged under the Hospitalised Act, then the Hospitalised Act have to be acknowledged, we've mentioned in the previous video, in all accuracy in its calculation. And when its calculation are affecting the mental wellness in our countries, and the mental wellness are calculated in accordance to the poverty circumstances in our countries, then the Hospitalised Act, that all hospitals are acknowledged in their legislative responsibility, then have a right to then introduces its business communication office, its computerized office, that the Mental Wellness Act are then acknowledged in. And when it only becomes to us a telephone communication line between the Hospitalised Computerized Communication Office and between the Mental Wellness Computerized Communication Office, then it is not yet only a telephone line. It's a business office in all its responsibility, in all that it has to be responsible at, in all that fair processes in accordance to legislation have to adhere to. In all that legislation are being updated on a regular basis. In all that legislation are then therefore acknowledged on. And when it's such a sensitive data board, a computerized board in a hospital, and it affects the circumstances in the international world, And it relates to so much poverty circumstances based on the accuracy of information that are being imported on the data board. In the data board are in all sensitivity, in all acknowledgement. Then the sensitivity, the accuracy, the responsibility are then for all business officers. To then, under the constitutional right, acknowledge the responsibility that it have towards the Hospitalised Act. The responsibility that all acknowledgement officers have under the office business to acknowledge its responsibility and its employment role. And therefore, under the curriculum that are the Schools Calculation Act, that are a curriculum under its constitutional right. The hospital have a right, I've mentioned in our previous video last week, to employ employees under their legislative acknowledgement, under the school colour acknowledgement. The hospital can by no means employ an employee that have not been acknowledged under the Curriculums Calculation Act. Because for you to attend the science class at your secondary school are then there for your hospital employment. And when it's not only acknowledged under the school curriculum acknowledgement, and it's acknowledged in its own acknowledgement, like I've mentioned, my Queen Mum Universe and a George Philander School of Colour Afrikaans Duitse translation journeys. Then the Act have to adhere to its responsibility to be implementing processes that are safe, that are not endangering the country or its people. And like I've mentioned in the previous video last week, the South African government's responsibility to employ people under the Hospitalised Act that are employed under the responsibility to be responsible in its employment duty. I've mentioned in my previous video last week a name of an employee at South African Paarl Hospital that have no right to be employed under the communication line in accordance to all that me, Queen Ribea Elise, have experienced on my journey. It's a statutory constitutional right for South African government to implement the office business fair acknowledgement under the Mental Wellness Act, that are the act to be responsible in its duty in its business office communication line. And for South African government to play with the Hospitalised Act when it looks like it's only a South African communication line, when it's a computerized communication line that stretches far in international countries, far in international wombs. It's a computerized telephone line that stretches into a person's human body. The sensitivity for employees to have a right to then therefore be rightly acknowledged in their employment duty are then for South African government to not manipulate their constitutional right under the Hospitalised Act, that are the Mental Wellness Act. There are my calculation that third world countries are 90% mentally unwell in our 50-year journey, in our pre-parents' 100-year journey communication line, 100-year journey computerized office that were introduced to us in these 100 years, that we all attended school at in the curriculum under the Calculation Act, that are the Mental Wellness Act. in all its responsibility. And when South African government have manipulated the communication line in front of me, Ribea Elise's journey, in front of my very eyes, and I'm sitting in Auckland, New Zealand, feeling disturbed under the communication line that our computerized office, that I implemented and built in all sensitivity, in all acknowledgement. And while the computerized communication office are sensitive, then the responsibility to be responsible under the Constitutional Act are then the legislative requirement to adhere to legislation under the Hospitalised Act, under who can be employed at a hospital in any country, who have a right of employment, who have a right to have fair processes in acknowledgement to the journey that the families have journeyed in the International Constitutional Act, the act that introduces families to one another. And when legislation responds so thoroughly in me, Queen Ribea Elise's years, in acknowledgement to my birth womb, Queen Ribea Elise, in acknowledgement to all that were implemented in its school color acknowledgement, Queen Ribea Elise, in acknowledgement to my Queen Mom Universe, Anna George Philander, whom School of Color Afrikaans Data Translation Journey Communication Office in the Chinese Government Scientific Office, my Evoke Business Introduction on all cell phone media pages. Queen Ribea Elise, in acknowledgement to the computerized responsibility to respond in all accuracy. Then it is our right to request the fair introduction that we have been introduced to, in acknowledgement to our responsibility in our journey's communications. Our right under the constitutional law the law that constitutes, that directs us, that walks our journeys in all accuracy, in all acknowledgement. The law that therefore responds to legislation in all accuracy. That then becomes the mental wellness law. My brother King Richard George Philander, the constitutional law. My brother King Martin George Philander, the legislative court of law. My brother King Jacques Philander, the human rights law. My brother King Anton George Philander, the statutory law, the law that stipulates what is fair, what is right, and has my brothers in South Africa not been educating it in all thoroughness, that me, Queen Ribea Elise, can sit in New Zealand on a couch and I can do my educations in all accuracy. Has my sister Queen Antoinette that studied law at Stellenbosch University, that our legislation in all acknowledgement to our Queen Mom Universe and our George Throne Womb, that are at the Council Office in England in all acknowledgement to the Journeys Communication Office that walks so clearly, so thoroughly, that educates in all accuracy, that by no means can the earth be so disrupted. By no means can there be so much people in poverty when the communication line have introduced us so thoroughly in our Journeys Communication Offices. My sis Queen Baby Ewana, next to Queen Mom Universe and George Philander, in Northern Cape, not Northern Cape, in California, South Africa. The law that introduces Have Queen Mummy Universe and George Philander then not arrived in Paarl Community, South Africa, in all accuracy, legislative, Your Honor, Queen Mummy Universe, Honor George Philander, School of Color, Afrikaans Duitse Translation Journeys. A communication office that are so thoroughly educated in our years. That are not only a computerized office, but that are us in the womb's journey, in its introductions. That are sensitively how responsible are we in our journey's communication office. And when we are educating mindset control over our reactions, and we have seen so much on the news, and we have to learn to be responsible in all that we have been introduced to. And then in all sensitivity, it would just be fair for governmental officials to acknowledge all that they have been introduced to in the communication office that they are employed in. To acknowledge their constitutional right. Their right to adhere to the sensitivity that are all that can be accessed. Like the Bible would say in Genesis 1 verse 7, the star television communications, the under the sea communications, and then therefore the legislative court of law would say all that were built and implemented on earth. All that were then introduced. It is just our constitutional right as governmental officials to then therefore be responsible in its constitutional right. That are our statutory right. That becomes our human right. That becomes a human reaction and the mindset control over our reactions. Mindset control over attitude with me, Queen Ribea Elise.